This is how I got into photography, and I started documenting the textile mills in northern New England, and particularly in Manchester, New Hampshire, which was named after Manchester, England, and it became the world's largest single textile mill. It went along the Merrimack River. Here is an exhibition of my photographs wrapped around hollow core doors and hanging in the Currier Gallery of Art Museum in Manchester for a show that I did. And I experimented with putting some of the pictures onto sheets of plexiglass so that they float in space to form a chance to show much more than is normally shown in a gallery, in an art gallery where the pictures are just separated and placed on the walls. I've designed these exhibits myself, and I did all of the printing and all of the enlarging, and I even had to cut a hole in the ceiling of my darkroom in order to put the enlarger high enough to be able to make the prints, some of which you see here that were on the wall of the museum. But part of this show was imported to Great Britain to show at the Royal Institute of British Architects Heights Gallery in London, and then the show was taken to Bradford. And I have to thank Marcus Binney of Save Britain's Heritage and Ken Powell of Save Britain's Heritage for the hard work and help they did to organize these shows. And I'm very proud of having had the chance to show this in London. Here, as you see, the floating pictures enabled me to have the gallery show in what was essentially a meeting room in central London with the complete collection that I had put together for it. And that simultaneous with this, Save Britain's Heritage published the book Satanic Mills, of which I'm one of the co-authors, and there are several other authors in this, to describe the mill towns of both Yorkshire and Lancashire. And of course, Yorkshire was the woolen mills, and Lancashire the cotton mills, but it's a very symbolic and experiential in a way, because the sheep grazed the hills and the wool was harvested from sheep that grazed these hills, and the vegetation was kept low in the large open green fields that characterized this Yorkshire landscape. And of course, this mill in the base of in the valley here, these mills were not run by water power like the New England mills, but with steam power, so they had chimneys. But this one, called Satanic Mills, I had to have been built before the RMS Titanic crashed and sank on its maiden voyage, and certainly made that name no longer of interest, I'm sure, to mill owners. But here, Huddersfield was one of the most impressive mill towns, and so much of these views here in Bradford, the buildings are now no longer there, and these pictures were taken in 1969, so more than half a century ago. The mill towns were still pretty much intact, although the textile mill companies had moved out, and many of them were abandoned spaces. And at least one of the productive results was that the government stopped tearing down the workers' housing in the mills that were connected with the textile industry after Save Britain's Heritage launched the shows and the book and helped to change government policy in Britain. But I show that these date back here in the 1840s view of these buildings that I just showed here, show those same buildings there in 1840 etching, and here you see it, the same view that I shot in 1976. And this was a barge canal, not a water power canal, the way it was in New England. Here, one of the many publications that were published at that time. But the loss of this landscape was as profound in Britain as it was in New England. And here you see how this iconic view has just the most unsympathetically designed new building placed in it. And this view of Huddersfield, of the iconic chimneys in the mill on the right, is all gone now. And back to Manchester, New Hampshire, to show the most iconic view I shot. And in order to get this picture with a 4x5 view camera, I had to angle my tripod and put a large weight from some of the junked machinery hanging on the other end of it to launch it out, cantilevered out the window to be able to get this view, which with the workers' housing on the left and the canal building, which was storage and offices on the right, and the mill, the textile mill, rearing up with its iconic Victorian tower in the distance there. Sadly, all of this disappeared. But here you see the difference between what had been there and what happened under the guise of what they called urban renewal. And all it was adding paved streets and parking spaces where there had been this wonderful power canal that ran between the mills. So with that, I just capture one of my first pictures. It's a digital picture, which, since I worked for a period of time for the federal government in what's called FEMA, or Federal Emergency Management Agency, after my teaching position at Berkeley, I was allowed on the site of the collapsed towers after 9/11, where the planes ran into these very same buildings, the World Trade Center, the picture you see at the top of what were the world's tallest buildings at the time they were built. And now here you see in the picture the remaining piece of one of the towers still standing while they were cleaning up the site. But this shows you a little bit as a precursor for what I'll be showing you from my Piranesi project, or the Rome Was, the root of the book and the movie, of the angles that I was able to aim the camera from a single vantage point to capture this long, and in this case a wide view of the site. And it's not the normal kind of panorama, but I'm dragging these together in a way which doesn't look distorted. That's what I'll be talking about now, that I learned so much from working with the works of Piranesi, who in many of his pictures was able to capture views that he did with a sketch pen on a pad of paper before he did etchings and engravings of these sites. So moving into that, I'm going to focus on one particular chapter in my book, which I call The Science of the Art, because there really is a science here. What I discovered from all of this is that photography, though it's a new art, is not necessarily exactly how we see views and how the pre-photographic artists rendered those views. But one of the things they always did when they were documenting or drawing buildings and spaces is they made sure that their vertical lines were parallel, because how we see and when we look around a space is that we see these buildings not the way a camera lens sees them. And I'm going to describe that a little bit more in a minute. For example, of showing Eugene Ache, and then, before that, the very first photograph, one of the very first photographs ever taken by Daguerreotype, who invented the Daguerreotype. 1839, you see the vertical lines are perfectly parallel. And this is not a later print that does that. That's the way he did it on the plate. and then Ucinace, and then going on to this. The pictures, again, another picture that I shot at 9/11. But you see how important vertical rectification is here, because had I just had the camera, which is, of course, a simple camera in my hand, was not taking a tripod and a view camera around with me, that was all burned up in the fire. So I had a simple hand camera to be able to be on this site. But if I couldn't rectify it, everything would look tilted, and it would not really document what in fact is tilted and what is not. I show this even more dramatically in this case here, now in Rome, of the Church of the Four Fountains by Borromini, and you see how narrow the street is in front of it. If you look around that blue car and the building on the right, in order to be able to shoot an elevation of this building with my hand camera, these are the pictures that it generated. In order to be able to get the whole thing as an elevation, those are the pictures that I have to work with. And the result of the work that I did with those photographs, which I'll describe as we go through, results in this as an elevation. It's so much more descriptive of the architecture of this building than just snapshots looking up at it, certainly. I now will show you the picture that started my project. And I was already about a third of the way through my grant when I went to Hadrian's Villa with a colleague from the National Park Service. And we walked around the site, and on one of the signs that you see the people looking at in that picture, they had printed a Piranesian engraving view, just to inform the people that the building that they're looking at, the one that you see just behind here, this is the exterior, is the Grande Terme, or the large bath, at Hadrian's Villa. And when I found my way to the view that Piranesi had to have seen in order to do his engraving, there was no way of backing up. I mean, there's a wall right there. And so, in fact, at that very point where I stood there and looked at the view, I realized he had done a picture of it that documents 180-degree width of space across the view, and that the door on the left and the door on the right, there I'd have to turn my body 90 degrees to be facing those openings. And so in order to document that with a wide lens on my hand camera, no tripod, nothing like that, no view camera, no rising front, I have shot them here. The lens was wide enough that it took only 6 pictures to cover the area, but it took me about 3 months before I could figure out a way to make these into images. But if I were to simply do a linear perspective of this view, this is what it would look like, this ugliness of it. It goes way beyond how wide our eye sees. And so when Piranesi did it, and his art here shows it all as compressed as if he's further away, but nonetheless, it's also a result, I think, of a very different phenomenon that exists when human beings simply look at a space compared to how a camera lens sees and documents the space. So here, as anybody can experience, if you just simply are looking at my slideshow or looking at a book or anything, we have only about 2% foveal vision, and the rest is peripheral vision. And Leonardo da Vinci actually documented and discussed this and became really aware of how that affects his art. So here we see how that is going. And for example, you look at this plan, and it's only in the very central part that we see that full resolution, which is described on this left-hand image here as the having full acuity versus a poor acuity. And this is true with everybody. Otherwise, our minds would be processing too much information. It wouldn't be able to handle it. So we're scanning our eyes everywhere when we're looking at something. Well, an artist is doing exactly that too. And so what I think is going on here is he scanned this view and created a flat image, and it's his own artistic experience and high quality that allowed him to do that. So turning my photographs into that same kind of thing was a challenge, and it became the core of my art while I was at the American Academy in Rome, to be able to work with photographs on a computer for the first time with Photoshop, what is now the Adobe program Photoshop, which is much more powerful now than it was 20 years ago when I was there, or 18 years ago when I was at the Academy. But you see here how this has preserved the quality of space that Piranesi taught me to see it as, and how in his time all the alluvial and the fill that had come in had raised the elevation of the floor, which I've preserved this one little piece of his engraving to show. It was important to me to try to see how could this be an art where his art informs mine, and I bring them together into my own artistic product here, recognizing in every respect the quality of Piranesi's work, but looking now across a quarter of a millennium of time in a classical ruin that had not changed remarkably between the time when he was alive in the middle of the 18th century and 250 years later, to be able to photograph the views that he stood and sketched and then later engraved. So looking at his Tossi Temple, it wasn't even open to the public at the time I was there. It's in Tivoli as well as the Hadrian's Villa. And I'm marking the eye level, which means the whole upper part is what would have to be caught by a rising front in a traditional camera. But here, as you see from all in this case, 9 pictures in order to cover the area that shows in his single engraving, and how in order to turn that into a single picture was itself a challenge. But here, looking at a very important church in central Rome by Borromini, Sapienza means wisdom. And this is a church without a nave and without a crossing and without an apse, and it's essentially a single central space in which the religious services take place, almost like a chimney-formed space, because in order to actually document what appears to me when I'm there physically, I had to bring all those pictures I just showed you together to show you what it looks like in its entirety. And after a lot of work to try to get it in a way that looks undistorted as a flat image now, using my foveal vision when I was in it to see the space and looking up into it, I feel that this captures the architecture of that space. And of course, no other way could I think of that photography could come close to doing that. So working with these views taught me a lot about a new way of doing photography than what I had done with my 4x5 view camera with single images, because the only way that's come along with the ease of being able to connect the images together into a single view is with digital photography. Now, it's interesting to turn to the Pantheon in Rome, which of course you're all familiar with. It's pretty much about the only classical ancient building that has survived intact because it was converted to a Christian church early enough on before it had fallen into ruin. And so what's interesting then from a photographic standpoint is to just log on to Google and Google the interior of the Pantheon, and I just show you a snap screen grab of what turns up with that. It shows you that just the interior, I don't see a single image in here that really moves one about what you experience when you actually walk into this space and then look up at it and look all around with your foveal vision, of course, and see it. And interestingly enough, Piranesi didn't really do one of his dramatic interiors in the Pantheon. I think he was more interested in the ruins than in the one surviving building. And this is the view he shows, and I think it was so large and enveloping, it was hard for him to really capture it. And then his son, Francesco Piranesi, tried to do it from within the space, and here is this asymmetrical view showing it, which is where he actually sort of captured it more completely. But the challenge was, is there a way to get the photography to really work? And I shot 9 pictures of the interior, and I'll never forget when I was standing on a bench to do this with a hand camera, of course. They don't allow tripods and professional equipment in any of these, in almost any of the spaces in central Rome. So I'm standing on this bench, and I saw a guy coming, waving at me and then coming over towards me. And I managed to shoot the last of these pictures just in time before he ordered me off the bench. And so this is the result that I got from working with that photography. And it's not easy, and I had to do it several times over again to get the effect, which is to have the effect of the oculus not looking straight at me, because it's essentially over my head, looking up. It's almost, at the 11 o'clock angle and round. So making a flat image to show the view in a dynamic way is a challenge, and it's an art. It's not easy. And here is if I broke it into pieces, the picture of it, and you can see how trying to bring it together. And there are actually some more pieces. The roof was not covered by a single shot like that. And the roof is, of course, so important from an engineering perspective because it's unreinforced concrete, and it's 2,000 years old. And so I'm going around the world, including London and Oxford and Cambridge in 2019, talking about concrete construction as much as with traditional construction, like timber and masonry with bricks. But the concrete, if it had been reinforced with steel, it wouldn't be there today because the steel would have rusted. And many concrete buildings don't last even as much as 100 years. So it's very interesting when I'm dealing with the ruins of ancient Rome, and they built stuff to last, and it's only because they were demolished. And in fact, they had a lime kiln in the forum where they threw in the sculptures and the architectural fragments in order to make lime mortar for modern construction. So here is all that's left of ancient Rome in the forum, and you can see the picture that this is the only picture in the book where I take it back to with a reconstruction photograph by a modern historian and artist to show a piece of what it would have been perhaps in the time of the Romans, the ancient Romans. So I now switched to when I got permission to go to the mayor's office and shoot a picture out his window of the Forum, which is off the back of the Capitolio Hill. And here is my picture that is close to match it as possible. But what's interesting is that this was more of a telephoto view on Piranesi's part. And so I used the technique I learned working with his wide-angle shots to shoot a wider view by composing what I call photo mosaics rather than panoramic views, photo mosaic of photographs to capture all of that width. What's so interesting, of course, that I learned is that in Piranesi's time, the Roman Forum was known as the cow pasture. Campo Vacino means cow pasture, and here the cows in the central Forum. And of course, the reason why there's so much soil and grass in the Forum is that once Rome was abandoned, the flooding was almost annual, bringing soil and debris into the space, such that the accumulation covered the ground. And here you see one of his views where, in fact, this arch here, he's recomposed how the parts fit together to make a dramatic picture, because this arch is this arch right here. Whereas what I've shown here, my photographs, where I changed this to the color, I didn't have to distort them at all. His view of these columns was precisely right on to their actual shape and length and proportions. But what is interesting is that the columns off the back of the Capitolio, the central city hall of Rome, the soil had accumulated to this height. And there are two pictures historically, so it's not a distortion. One by the Dutch artist Heemskerk, and then also from Piranesi more than 200 years later. And you see that a very slight further accumulation from Piranesi's view here, which is a little bit closer to the Capitol. So over the 2,000 years of that ancient Rome had been essentially largely abandoned, the accumulation was extraordinary. And so it's interesting to see that. I'm going to show you now, just outside of the central Forum area is the Forum of Augustus. It has what they call the firewall, and it was known as the firewall because the buildings which would appear here on the right, like this, were wooden and fire-prone and all of that. And it was an area that was the red light district of central Rome, of the ancient Roman era. And this picture may be just somewhat imaginary. It's playing off of that history. And I don't know who did this picture or the date of it. I found it on the internet. But nevertheless, it captures what it is that I want to share with you about how this, why this is here. But more importantly is the fact that Piranesi nor me could see that wall all from one station point, standing in one spot. There was no way to see all of this wall. But I wanted to now, in respect for Piranesi, find a way to bring my photography to document that wall, because it's all still there, just as he had etched it and engraved it. And so in order to cover that wall, I show three pictures here. To cover it, not being able to see it, I shot those pictures, but then I merged them together using the technique that I've learned how to do to respect the foveal and peripheral vision, of being able to merge it in a way where it makes a flat image that's eminently understandable and not a feeling of distortion. So here is that view that resulted. And when I take away all of Piranesi, all you see is the parked cars and the dumpsters. But otherwise, the wall is entirely there, just as he had etched it in his time in the 18th century. One of the more interesting works of art that I worked with was not by Piranesi, but it was 150 years later by Bierstadt, an artist born in Germany, but who migrated to North America and who documented the western hills and mountains with some of the most extraordinary works of art. And here in the ancient Porticus of Octavia, there was a view that he did of that same spot right there, which had become what was known as the fish market. And so you're seeing here the slum area that this had become, and the tipsy guys and the women doing the work that he documented in that fish market area. And in the distance is the arch to what was then one of the first Jewish ghettos. I think it was the second. There was one in Venice and then this one here. So it was a Jewish ghetto where that arch is. And interestingly enough, he documents a fellow who's been identified in his art as an American tourist with his wife there walking through the fish market, holding the then version of the Baedeker Guide of Rome. But interestingly enough, if I show you the transition of that space to what it is today, there is a sense of loss as well as whatever preservation gain there is. But here, this is all that it is today, and the arch for the Jewish ghetto is gone. And the later buildings have been removed to expose the ancient ruin, in effect. Before I finish, I want to show Piranesi's view of St. Peter's and how, using the technique I learned from him, I was able to shoot pictures just inside the door of the entrance. This is the very first arch of the long nave of this most amazing space, and I was gifted with the light that was coming in then. And I show one picture that I composed just as an art piece, where some of the sculptures that I saw in the side chapels of St. Peter's I've used as an art piece looking to overlay onto photographs looking up into Michelangelo's dome that rests astride the crossing in St. Peter's. So before I finish, I want to show where I've used this technique in a totally different environment to document a space. And here, for example, is Machu Picchu in Peru, but using this documentary photography with it, I was able to shoot a wide-angle view without this stretching distortion that I showed earlier by composing it all together. And you can see how the mountains, how the river there wraps its way around the space behind that pinnacle on which the Machu Picchu ruin sits. So I will show one of the more extraordinary pictures I got in Rome on a later visit, the rainbow shot from the Vittoriano. And notice these columns here. They are in the Forum. I'll show you a picture that I shot in order to do a photographic merging with one of Piranesi's invenzioni, or his magically made up views of this one, which is called a spacious and magnificent port, in Italian, of course. And I took this view, which Piranesi could never have seen. This is a monument to Victor Emmanuel. It was essentially finished in the 1930s in central area just above the Forum. And then I merged it with that as a graphic art. I mean, it's not historical or anything, but I was really so moved by Piranesi's magnificent port that I wanted to bring it into my photographic studies in this way. So I'm going to conclude a return to the dissolve between one and the other that inspired me to do this entire project, and how that particular view by Piranesi had so moved me that it transformed my work as a photographer, and I was essentially working with a camera that only fit in my hand, and but merging the pictures together, they enlarged the images entirely. So please feel free to find my book and download and play the movie that goes with it. And I look forward to communicating with you when I leave you with this. So I wish to just say thank you very much to a crowd of what I was told is about 80 people. And so thank you very much for listening.